You think evil hides in the shadows, don't you? That it's some monster lurking in the dark, waiting for nightfall. But some evils, the worst ones, they don't hide at all. They stand right out in the open. They smile at you on Main Street. They shake your hand. They wear their finest clothes on Sunday and preach about morality from the steps of the town church. Jack Turner had known men like that his whole life. He'd just never had proof. Not until that blistering July morning in 1887. The sun was already a mean, angry thing in the sky before he'd even had his breakfast. Heat waves were rolling off the baked dirt of his ranch, looking like ghosts trying to escape the ground. The whole world felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Jack was riding fence along the far western edge of his property, the part nobody ever went to. Dust and sweat made a gritty paste on the back of his neck. It was a lonely job, but Jack preferred it that way. Loneliness was simple. People were not. He passed the ruins of the old mission church, nothing but a few blackened foundation stones left from a fire that had ripped through it years back. The townsfolk called it a tragedy, an act of God. But Jack had always wondered. Fires don't start themselves. And that's when he saw something by the old stone well. From the saddle, it just looked like a heap of rags someone had dumped under the shade of a lone, half-dead cottonwood. A common enough sight. Drifters passing through sometimes left their trash behind. But something about the stillness of that heap was wrong. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. Jack reined in his horse, a knot tightening in his gut. The air grew heavy, silent. He swung down, his worn boots crunching in the brittle, sun-scorched grass. Every step he took toward that cottonwood felt heavier than the last, like he was wading through molasses. A feeling he knew all too well, the feeling that something bad had happened here, and he was about to find out just how bad it was. It wasn't a pile of rags. It was a person, a young woman, maybe 24, leaning against the rough bark of the tree trunk as if the only thing holding her upright in this world was that dying piece of wood. Her face was a ghostly pale under the brutal sun, but the bruises stood out like angry purple clouds against a winter sky. Her lips were cracked and bleeding from thirst. Her breathing was so shallow, so faint, it was barely a whisper of life. She was gripping a filthy, torn wool blanket around her shoulders, her knuckles white. She held it like it was the most precious thing she owned, as if letting it go for even a second meant she would die right there. Jack had seen plenty of hurt in his time. He'd seen ranch accidents, nasty bar fights, even the aftermath of an outlaw scrap or two on the trail. But this was different. The marks on her, they weren't from bad luck or a clumsy fall. They were made with purpose. They were deliberate. And there were too many for him to count. Each one told a story he didn't want to read. A fat, black fly buzzed near her cheek, and she flinched away. But it wasn't the insect that scared her. It was him. His shadow falling over her was enough to make her tremble. He crouched down slow, real slow, holding his hands out where she could see them. He spoke low and soft, the way you would to a spooked horse. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm not gonna hurt you. I'm here to help." And that's when his eyes caught something else, nestled between the folds of that disgusting blanket. A small, leather-bound notebook. Its cover was worn smooth and stained dark in several places. And beside it, catching a sharp glint of the merciless morning sunlight, was a brass lawman's badge. The sight of it made his mouth go instantly dry. His heart started hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Because he knew that badge. He knew exactly who it belonged to. And the man who wore it was supposed to have died a hero in the church fire 2 years ago. Whoever did this to her wasn't some random drifter passing through. This was tied to someone powerful, someone respected, someone untouchable in the nearby town of Redemption Creek, someone whose hand Jack had shaken just last week. And right there, under that cruel July sun, with the smell of dust and fear in the air, Jack realized that whatever secrets were wrapped up in that filthy wool blanket were enough to burn the whole damn town to the ground, and maybe him along with it. He didn't waste another second out there. The sun was a predator, sucking the life out of that girl faster than a vampire. Questions could wait. Survival couldn't. He scooped her up, blanket and all. She weighed next to nothing. He'd carried sacks of feed that were heavier, but carrying her made his arms ache in a way he'd never felt before. It was the ache of a profound and terrible responsibility. Back at the ranch house, he laid her gently on the old leather couch by the front window. He fetched his canteen and tipped a small, slow stream of water onto her cracked lips. She drank like each swallow was agony, her eyes squeezed shut. But she never, not for a single second, let go of that blanket. Whatever was in there, it was her anchor in the storm. Jack figured he could wait. He poured himself a cup of lukewarm coffee and sat in the chair opposite her, his shotgun resting against the wall, close enough to grab. He knew from experience that people talk more when they finally feel safe, but he was starting to wonder if safe even existed anymore. By late afternoon, the cicadas were screaming their song from the trees, a deafening, high-pitched drone that matched the tension in the room. The air was thick with heat and unspoken words. She finally opened her eyes. They were a deep, intelligent brown, and they were sharp, even under the thick haze of fear and pain. He told her his name was Jack. She said hers was Laura. Her voice was barely a whisper, so quiet he had to lean in to hear it. It sounded like she was afraid the very walls of the house might be listening, ready to tell on her. And then she said something that made the coffee in Jack's stomach turn to ice. He wasn't the first one. Jack just stared at her, not understanding. He who? The man who hurt me, she whispered, her eyes darting toward the window. But he wasn't alone. There are others. They have a kind of club. She told him there had been other girls, some younger than her, some not much older. All of them hurt, all of them terrified into silence. And the men who did it, they weren't hiding in some outlaw camp in the hills. They ran the town. They owned the saloon. They wore the badges. They stood on the church steps every Sunday morning, smiling and shaking hands, pretending to be pillars of the community. They were the men who ran Redemption Creek. Jack just sat there, the wooden chair digging into his back, letting her words settle into the silence of the room. He knew the names she whispered. He'd played poker with one of them. He'd sold cattle to another. He'd shared a beer with the sheriff just last week, laughing at some stupid joke. Sheriff Miller, Mayor Thompson, even Reverend Cole. If what Laura was telling him was the truth, and he saw no lie in the depths of those haunted brown eyes, then his town wasn't just a little corrupt. It was rotten to its very core. A beautiful apple, shiny on the outside, but filled with worms and decay on the inside. She stopped talking as suddenly as she had started. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself, leaned her head back against the worn leather, and closed her eyes again, retreating back into the safety of her own darkness. Jack knew better than to push her for more, but he also knew something else, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone. Men like that, men with everything to lose, wouldn't just let her walk away. They thought she was dead, left for the coyotes by the old well. But now they'd find out she wasn't. They'd know she'd been found, and they would come for her. They would come to finish the job. And that meant they were coming for him too. The trouble he'd been avoiding his whole life was no longer on the horizon. It was riding straight for his front gate. Jack didn't get a wink of sleep that night. The July air was suffocating, the kind that sticks to your skin and makes a man feel restless and on edge. He sat out on the porch in his rocking chair, his Winchester rifle resting across his knees, his eyes scanning the endless, inky blackness of the prairie. He'd been around long enough to know that trouble doesn't send a polite invitation. It kicks the door in, and just before the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky a bruised purple, he saw it. A single rider on the ridge, silhouetted against the coming light. A man in a black hat, moving slow and deliberate. Jack's gut twisted. This wasn't a neighbor coming to borrow sugar or a lost traveler looking for the main road. This was a wolf, and it had caught the scent of blood. The man didn't wave. He didn't call out a friendly, "Hello." He just rode straight toward the house, his path as direct and menacing as a drawn blade. He rode like he owned the land and everything on it. Jack stepped off the porch, the rifle held loose and easy in his hands. He met the stranger halfway in the dusty yard. The world was quiet, save for the crunch of his own boots and the steady clopping of the horse's hooves. "Morning," Jack said, his voice flat and devoid of any warmth. The stranger didn't answer right away. He swung down from his saddle with a fluid, predatory grace. His hand was resting on the butt of his holstered pistol, casually, like it was a permanent part of his anatomy. He had cold, dead eyes, the kind that had seen too much and cared about none of it. "I'm here for the girl," the man finally said, his voice a low growl. He didn't even bother with a pretense. "Give her to me. It ain't your concern." The heat in Jack's chest had nothing to do with the rising sun. "She's under my roof," Jack replied, his own voice dropping to a dangerous level. "That makes her my concern." The man in the black hat actually grinned, but it was a horrifying sight. It was the grin of a skull. It held no humor, only malice. "That's a real shame," he said. "For you." His hand twitched. It was just a tiny movement, a flicker of his fingers. But for Jack, the world seemed to slow down to a crawl. The universe went silent for half a heartbeat. Then it exploded with the deafening crack of gunfire. When the acrid blue-gray smoke cleared, the stranger was lying face down in the dirt, his unfired pistol just inches from his outstretched fingers. Jack's Winchester was still warm in his hands, a faint wisp of smoke curling from the barrel. He hadn't even consciously aimed. Years of instinct had taken over. He stood there for a long moment, the silence of the prairie rushing back in to fill the void left by the violence. The sun was cresting the horizon now, bathing the scene in a bloody red light. He didn't feel triumph. He didn't feel relief. He just felt a profound and weary sense of dread. This was only the beginning. He dragged the body out past the gate and left it for the vultures. No sense leaving it where Laura would see. He had a feeling she'd seen enough dead men already. Inside, she was awake, sitting bolt upright on the couch. Her eyes were wide with a terror that cut him to the quick. She didn't have to ask what happened. The gunshot had said it all. She already knew. Jack poured himself a cup of coffee, his hands shaking ever so slightly. He sat down at the kitchen table across from her. The rising sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. "They know where you are now," he said, his voice grim. That was Sheriff Miller's younger brother. Laura's face went even paler, which he hadn't thought was possible. The net wasn't just closing in. It had already been thrown. "We've got work to do," Jack said, his eyes meeting hers, "and not a lot of time to do it. If you've been riding along with this story so far, you know the trail ahead is only going to get rougher, steeper, and more dangerous. So stick with me, because there's more coming than you might think, and you will not want to miss how this all turns out. Go on and hit that subscribe button so you don't get left behind when the next shots are fired." By noon that day, the July sun had baked the yard so hot you could probably fry an egg on the fence rail. But Jack wasn't thinking about the heat. He and Laura were at the kitchen table, and she had finally carefully unwrapped the contents of the filthy wool blanket. He felt like he was looking at the components of a bomb. There was the leather-bound journal, its pages crammed with tight, frantic handwriting. There was the tarnished brass badge, Deputy Sheriff, Redemption Creek. And there were other things. A torn piece of expensive blue ribbon, the kind he'd seen the mayor's wife wear in her hair, a single ornate cufflink with the initial C engraved on it, and a lock of blonde hair, tied with a simple piece of string. Every piece of it felt like holding a live rattlesnake, dangerous but too important to let go. Laura sat across from him. Some of the strength was returning to her. The water and a little bit of food had helped, but something else was shining in her eyes now. Not just fear, but a flicker of pure, unadulterated resolve. This was a woman who had survived hell and was ready to burn it down. Her voice was steady now, in a way that only comes from having already endured the worst things imaginable. She pointed to the badge. "That was my father's," she said, her voice catching just for a moment. "Deputy Evan Grant. They told everyone he died a hero, trying to save the church records from the fire." Jack's blood ran cold. The church fire. It was all connected. "He didn't die in the fire, Jack," she continued, her eyes locking onto his. "They murdered him. He found out what they were doing. What they were doing to the girls who came through town with no family, no one to look for them." He started writing it all down. She tapped the cover of the journal. "That's his ledger. He was gathering proof. The names, the dates, the money they took. The ribbon belongs to Mayor Thompson's daughter. She, she was one of them. She tried to tell her father and he locked her away, called her hysterical. The cufflink. That belongs to Reverend Cole. He lost it one night. She didn't need to explain which night. Jack felt a wave of nausea. These were the men who ran his town, the men he saw every day. Why you, Laura? How did you get this? He asked gently. After they killed my father, they came for me, she whispered, the tremor returning to her voice. They knew he must have told me something. They took me. They hurt me. But they underestimated me. They thought I was just a scared little girl. I found where they'd hidden his journal. I took it. I was trying to get away, trying to get to the next town, when they caught me near the old well. Jack looked from the evidence on the table to the determined, haunted face of the young woman in front of him. He knew one thing for sure. Trying to get justice here in Redemption Creek wasn't just a bad idea. It was a death sentence. And if Sheriff Miller and his cronies got their hands on this journal, Laura wouldn't be the only one getting buried. The truth itself would be put in a shallow grave and forgotten forever. They needed to get this evidence, and Laura, somewhere far away, somewhere safe. San Francisco, Jack said, thinking aloud. There are newspapers there, federal marshals. They love nothing more than chewing up corrupt little towns like this one and spitting them out. But getting there was the problem. The stagecoach was watched. Miller's men were everywhere. The telegraph office was run by the mayor's nephew. They were living on an island, and the water surrounding them was filled with sharks. So Jack decided on the only way he knew. The old rancher's way. By saddle. Hard and fast. He'd ride west for 2 days through the Badlands where no posse would want to follow. He knew a man, a freight driver named Silas, who ran a route to Cheyenne. He was one of the few men in the territory Jack still trusted. He'd give the package to Silas and let the truth ride the rails east instead of the trails west. But there was no time to waste. Miller would know by now that his brother wasn't coming back. He'd be gathering a posse. By late afternoon, Jack had his fastest horse, a tough bay mare named Ghost, saddled and ready. He slipped the journal and the other evidence into a waterproof oilskin pouch and lashed it tight behind his saddle. Laura watched him from the porch, her arms wrapped around herself. He could feel the weight of her fear, but it wasn't for herself this time. It was for him. He handed her his second rifle, a heavy Winchester. Keep the doors locked and the shutters barred, he said. Don't open them for anyone. Not for anyone. He paused, his hand on the saddle horn. If I'm not back in 3 days, he said, his voice low and serious, you take that rifle and what's left of the food. Ride north. Don't stop until you hit Fort Bridger. Don't look back. Promise me. She just nodded, her eyes glistening. He didn't wait for her to say anything else. He swung into the saddle, gave her one last look, and spurred Ghost toward the burning orange of the western horizon. He didn't know if he was riding toward salvation or his own grave. But somewhere out there, beyond the shimmering heat waves, he knew that Sheriff Miller and his men were already saddling their horses. The hunt had begun. The first day was a blur of sun and dust. Jack pushed the bay mare hard, cutting across the open range, staying clear of the main trails. He navigated by the sun and the shape of the distant mountains, landmarks etched into his memory. He didn't stop to eat, just chewed on a piece of jerky from his saddlebag and drank sparingly from his canteen. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like the hoofbeats of an approaching posse. He made camp that night in a narrow rocky arroyo, choosing a spot that gave him a clear view of his back trail. He didn't dare light a fire. A cold camp was a safe camp. As darkness fell, the world became a symphony of chirping crickets and the lonely howl of a distant coyote. He sat with his back against a boulder, rifle in his lap, and listened. Sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford. He thought about Laura, alone back at the ranch. He pictured her face, the mix of fear and defiance in her eyes. He was doing this for her father, for all the other nameless girls. But a part of him knew he was also doing it for himself. For too long, he'd kept his head down, minded his own business, and let the quiet corruption of Redemption Creek fester. He'd told himself it wasn't his fight. He knew now that was a lie. Some fights, you don't get to choose. They choose you. Just after midnight, he heard it, the faint, unmistakable sound of a shod horse stumbling on loose rock. It came from the ridge above him. Jack's body went rigid. He melted back into the shadows, his rifle coming up to his shoulder, the cold metal of familiar comfort against his cheek. He wasn't breathing. He was just listening. There was more than one. He could hear the soft creak of saddle leather, a low, muttered curse. A posse. Miller's men. They were tracking him, and they were good. Way too good. It was almost like they knew exactly where he was going. He saw their silhouettes pass along the ridgeline, dark shapes against a sky full of stars. At least 5 of them. They hadn't spotted him yet, but they were close. Dangerously close. He had to move. Now. He silently gathered his gear, led Ghost out of the arroyo, keeping to the soft sand to muffle her steps. He had to double back, take a longer, more treacherous route through the canyons. It would cost him precious time, but it was better than the alternative. As he rode through the labyrinth of rock and shadow, a chilling thought struck him. How did they find him so fast? He was a skilled tracker himself, and he'd been careful to cover his trail. It didn't make sense. Unless they weren't just following his tracks, unless they knew his destination. The freight driver, Silas. Jack had known him for years, trusted him, but in a town as rotten as Redemption Creek, could anyone truly be trusted? Was his one hope for getting the evidence out actually a trap? The knot in his stomach tightened into a cold, hard stone. He was alone out here, hunted, and running straight into a potential ambush. The second day's sun was even more relentless. The landscape had changed, turning into a maze of sun-baked canyons and jagged rock formations known as the Devil's Backbone. It was hellish terrain, but it offered cover. Jack pushed on, his throat raw with dust, his eyes burning from the glare. The thought that Silas might betray him gnawed at him. If that route was compromised, he was out of options. He found a small, hidden spring late in the afternoon, a trickle of life in the middle of all that rock and death. He let Ghost drink her fill while he refilled his canteen, constantly scanning the canyon walls around him. The silence was unnerving. He hadn't seen any sign of the posse since the night before. That worried him more than seeing them on his tail. Were they trying to get ahead of him? To cut him off at the freight station? He had to know. He decided to take a huge risk. Instead of continuing west toward Silas's depot, he would climb to the top of the highest mesa and wait. From there, he could watch the main trail to the depot without being seen. It would cost him half a day, but walking into a trap would cost him his life. The climb was brutal. He had to leave Ghost hidden in a box canyon and make the ascent on foot, scrambling over loose scree and sharp rocks that tore at his hands. By the time he reached the flat top of the mesa, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in fiery shades of red and orange. He crawled to the edge and peered down. The trail was a thin, dusty ribbon snaking through the landscape below. He settled in to wait, his rifle by his side, his body aching with exhaustion. Hours passed. The moon rose, casting long, eerie shadows across the Badlands. Just when he was starting to think he'd made a mistake, he saw them. A group of riders moving slowly along the trail below. Not from the east, where he'd come from, but from the west. From the direction of the freight depot. It was the posse. Miller was with them, and they were riding alongside a large, slow-moving freight wagon. Silas's wagon. Jack's heart sank. He watched as the wagon pulled to a stop. Silas got down from the driver's seat. He walked over to Sheriff Miller, and the 2 men shook hands. Miller passed him a small, heavy-looking bag. Coin. The betrayal was a physical blow. It knocked the wind out of him. Silas, his friend, had sold him out. The whole plan was a trap. They weren't just following him. They were waiting for him. They were going to let him walk right into the depot, and then it would all be over. A cold, calculated fury began to replace his despair. They thought they had him cornered. They thought he was predictable. They were about to find out how wrong they were. He had one last, desperate option, a ghost of a chance. North. There was an old, abandoned mining trail that cut through the mountains. It was dangerous, barely passable, but it led toward the Union Pacific rail line. If he could reach the tracks, he could hop a train. It was a fool's hope, but it was the only one he had left. As he watched the sheriff and his treacherous friend laughing below, Jack made a new vow. He wasn't just going to deliver the evidence anymore. He was going to deliver a reckoning. Getting back to Ghost without being seen was a nightmare. Jack moved like a phantom, sliding down the treacherous rock face in near-total darkness, his muscles screaming in protest. Every falling pebble sounded like an avalanche to his strained ears. When he finally reached the bottom and put his hand on Ghost's muzzle to keep her quiet, he was shaking, not from fear, but from a potent cocktail of rage and adrenaline. The mining trail was even worse than he remembered. It was more of a goat path than a trail, a narrow ledge carved into the side of the mountain, with a sheer drop into blackness on one side. He had to dismount and lead Ghost, her iron horseshoes striking sparks on the flinty rock. The wind howled through the high passes, a mournful, lonely sound that seemed to mock his chances of survival. For 2 days, he and the horse were a single, struggling entity. They survived on gritty determination and the last of their water. He thought about Laura again, and the promise he'd made her. "If I'm not back in 3 days." The third day had come and gone. He could only pray she'd followed his instructions, that she was riding north to Fort Bridger, that she was safe. On the morning of the fourth day, as the sun rose over the jagged peaks, he saw it. Far below in the valley was a thin, dark line glinting in the morning light. 2 parallel lines stretching from east to west as far as the eye could see. The railroad. The relief was so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He had made it. He'd beaten the odds. He scrambled down the last of the mountain slope, leading the exhausted Ghost. He found a small grove of trees near the tracks to hide in and waited. He didn't know the train schedules, but he knew at least one freight train passed through daily. Hours crept by. The sun beat down. His hope began to waver. Had he missed it? Then he heard it, a low, distant rumble that grew steadily into the clatter and screech of steel on steel. A plume of black smoke appeared on the eastern horizon, a freight train heading west. This was it, his one shot. As the locomotive thundered past, Jack broke from cover, running alongside the tracks. He urged Ghost into a canter, her hooves pounding the ground. He had to match the train's speed. He grabbed the oilskin pouch with the evidence, pulled himself up on Ghost's back, and got as close as he dared to the moving cars. He spotted an open boxcar. Its door slid halfway back. He took a deep breath, stood up in the stirrups, and leaped. He slammed against the side of the boxcar, his fingers desperately clawing for a handhold. For a terrifying second he dangled, his boots scrambling for purchase, the ground a deadly blur beneath him. With a final agonizing grunt, he hauled himself up and tumbled into the dark, swaying interior of the car. He lay there gasping for air, his body a collection of bruises and scrapes. He had done it. He was on the train. He was safe. He crawled to the open door and looked back. Ghost was standing by the tracks, watching the train pull away. A lonely figure in a vast, empty landscape. Leaving her behind felt like leaving a part of himself. But as he watched his ranch, his town, and his old life recede into the distance, he noticed something else. A small column of dust on the horizon. Riders following the tracks. Miller. Somehow the sheriff knew. He wasn't giving up. He was relentless. And that's when Jack saw what was in the boxcar with him. It wasn't empty. It was filled with large wooden crates. He pried one open with his knife. Rifles. Brand new Army-issue Springfield rifles. And then he noticed the stenciling on the side of the crate. It wasn't addressed to a U.S. Army fort. It was addressed to Thompson Mercantile, Redemption Creek. Mayor Thompson. This wasn't just about hurting girls. This wasn't just about a land grab. This was bigger, much bigger. They were arming themselves for a war. But with who? And why? The journal in his pouch suddenly felt 100 times heavier. The secrets it held were darker and more far-reaching than he could have ever imagined. The train rattled on, carrying him further west. But Jack knew this wasn't an escape. It was just a temporary reprieve. He wasn't running from a small-town sheriff anymore. He was running from a conspiracy that was arming itself to the teeth, a conspiracy that had already killed a lawman and would not hesitate to kill again. and they knew exactly which train he was on. The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels was a constant reminder of his predicament. He was trapped in a moving steel cage, hurtling through enemy territory. He had no idea where the train's next stop was, but he knew Miller and his men would be waiting for him at some point down the line. He scrambled through the swaying boxcars, looking for a way out or a better place to hide. The train was mostly freight, timber, barrels of who knows what, and those crates of army rifles. Then at the very back, he found a single passenger car, old and rickety, likely for railroad workers or the odd budget-conscious traveler. And at the end of that car was a small, open platform on the caboose. An idea, a desperate and probably stupid idea, began to form in his mind. He couldn't stay on the train. They'd search it car by car. He had to get off, but not at a station. He spent the next hour working, his hands raw and bleeding. He used his knife to pry splinters from the wooden crates and tore strips from his own shirt to use as bindings. He needed a distraction, a big one. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, he saw his chance. The train was starting to slow as it approached a long, high wooden trestle bridge spanning a deep, rocky canyon. This was a place where the train would be vulnerable, moving at a crawl. Working frantically, he wedged a piece of wood into the coupling mechanism between the caboose and the passenger car. It wouldn't hold for long, but he hoped it would be long enough. Then he ran back to the boxcar with the rifles. He grabbed two of the heavy crates, grunting with the effort, and dragged them to the open door. The train was on the bridge now, the chugging of the engine echoing off the canyon walls. Below, the river was a silver ribbon in the fading light. Jack waited until the engine had crossed to the other side. Then, with a roar of exertion, he shoved the first crate of rifles out of the boxcar. It crashed onto the wooden ties of the bridge with a sound like a thunderclap, splintering into 100 pieces, spilling brand new rifles across the tracks. He shoved the second one out right after it. More splintering wood, more chaos. He had just created a roadblock on the bridge. The train couldn't go forward, and it couldn't easily reverse. Then he ran for the caboose. He could hear shouting from the front of the train, the screech of brakes. He burst onto the back platform just as his makeshift sabotage on the coupling gave way. With a loud groan of protesting metal, the caboose unhooked from the rest of the train. For a moment, it kept rolling forward from momentum. Then it began to slow, the rest of the train pulling away. Jack didn't hesitate. He looked down at the river, a 50-foot drop at least. He took a deep breath, held the precious oilskin pouch tight, and jumped. The fall felt like it lasted forever. He hit the water with a force that knocked the air from his lungs and sent a shockwave of cold through his entire body. The current was strong, grabbing him immediately, pulling him under. He fought his way to the surface, gasping for air, his clothes and boots dragging him down like anchors. He was alive. He looked up. The train was stopped on the bridge, a chaotic scene of silhouettes running back and forth. The lone caboose was slowly, silently rolling backward, away from the bridge and back the way it had come. He had bought himself time, but he was soaked, freezing, and stranded in the middle of nowhere, with a posse of killers somewhere behind him and an unknown conspiracy ahead. He swam for the shore, his muscles screaming, and collapsed on the muddy bank, shivering uncontrollably. As he lay there coughing up river water, he knew this fight was far from over. Miller would find a way across that canyon. He would pick up his trail, but Jack had the evidence. And now he had a new destination. Not San Francisco, not Cheyenne. There was only one place big enough and chaotic enough to get this story out and find federal help before Miller's shadow government took root. He had to get to Denver, and he had to do it on foot. The next few days were a special kind of hell. Jack traded his wet boots and gun belt to a passing farmer for a stale loaf of bread, a worn-out coat, and a pair of ill-fitting shoes. He looked less like a rancher and more like a beggar, which was exactly the point. He needed to be invisible. He walked the railway tracks east toward Denver, traveling mostly at night. During the day, he hid in barns or slept in ditches, the oilskin pouch with the journal tucked inside his shirt, a constant, heavy weight against his skin. Every distant shout, every barking dog sent a jolt of fear through him. He was a ghost, haunting the edges of civilization. He stole food when he had to, feeling a pang of guilt each time. a few vegetables from a garden, a couple of eggs from a chicken coop. He was becoming someone he didn't recognize, all for the sake of the truth in that pouch. After what felt like an eternity, he saw the faint glow of a major city against the night sky. Denver. He arrived at dawn, a ragged, bearded, exhausted man limping into a city bustling with life. The noise and the crowds were overwhelming after the silence of the wilderness. He kept his head down, avoiding eye contact, especially with the local police. For all he knew, Mayor Thompson's influence stretched this far. He knew he couldn't just walk into the U.S. Marshal's office. He was a wanted man. Miller would have undoubtedly put out a warrant for him, for murder, for horse theft, for anything that would stick. They'd arrest him and send him straight back to Redemption Creek to be hanged. He needed an ally, someone with power, but someone outside the official channels. He remembered a name, a man he'd met years ago during his brief and regrettable time working for the Pinkerton Detective Agency. A man who had left the agency because he found it too corrupt. A man who had become a journalist, a crusader known for taking on powerful, dangerous men. His name was Frederick Heston, and he ran a small, independent newspaper called the Denver Clarion. Finding the newspaper office wasn't hard. It was a small, cluttered space above a print shop, smelling of ink and cheap cigar smoke. Jack walked in, and a man with spectacles and a green eye shade looked up from his desk. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice weary. "I'm looking for Frederick Heston," Jack said, his own voice hoarse from disuse. The man took off his spectacles and polished them with a handkerchief. "You found him, and you are. My name is Jack Turner. We met once, a long time ago, in Kansas." Heston squinted, studying Jack's gaunt face. Recognition slowly dawned in his eyes. "Turner? Good God, man. You look like you've been dragged through hell backwards." "Close enough," Jack said. He reached into his coat and pulled out the oilskin pouch. He laid it on Heston's desk. It landed with a soft, heavy thud. "I've got a story for you, Mr. Heston," Jack said, his voice trembling with exhaustion and the sheer weight of what he was about to do. "A story about a town called Redemption Creek. It's a story of murder, corruption, and conspiracy, and it's all in here. But you need to know, if you print this, they will come for you too." Heston stared at the pouch, then back at Jack. A slow smile spread across his face, a smile that didn't hold any humor, but rather a kind of grim, excited purpose. It was the smile of a born fighter who had just been handed a worthy opponent. "Mr. Turner," he said, leaning back in his chair, "you have come to the right place. Tell me everything, and don't leave out a single detail." For the next 2 days, Jack didn't leave the newspaper office. Heston locked the doors, brought in food, and listened. He listened with an intensity that was unnerving, occasionally stopping Jack to ask a sharp, insightful question. He read every page of Deputy Grant's journal, his expression growing darker with each entry. He examined the badge, the ribbon, the cufflink. "This is dynamite, Jack," Heston said on the second night, pacing the cluttered office. "The rifles are the key. Thompson isn't just a corrupt mayor. He's trying to build a private army. This land grab scheme, it's not just for cattle grazing. The railroad is planning a new spur line through that territory. Whoever controls the land and the water rights will be unimaginably wealthy and powerful." Heston stopped pacing and looked at Jack. "This goes higher than a small-town mayor. Army-issue rifles don't just fall off a wagon. Someone in the military, someone in the territorial government is helping him." The scale of it was staggering. It made Jack feel small, insignificant. "So what do we do?" "We don't go to the marshals yet," Heston said, his eyes gleaming with strategic fire. "We go over their heads. We publish. We print every sordid detail from this journal. We print the names. Thompson, Miller, Cole. We print the story of Laura and her father. We create a firestorm so big that the president himself won't be able to ignore it. We force their hand." The next morning, the presses in the shop below began to run. The front page of the Denver Clarion was covered in a single bold headline: "The Rotten Heart of Redemption Creek." The story was an explosion. By noon, every copy was sold out. People were gathered on street corners reading the story aloud, their faces a mixture of shock and outrage. Other, bigger newspapers started picking it up. The telegraph wires hummed with the news. The story was spreading like a prairie fire. Jack felt a sliver of hope. Maybe, just maybe, it would work. That evening, as Jack and Heston were planning their next move, there was a loud, heavy knock at the door. It wasn't a friendly knock. Heston looked at Jack, his face grim. He pulled an old revolver from his desk drawer. Jack drew the pistol he'd taken from the farmer. "Who is it?" Heston called out. A deep, commanding voice answered. "U.S. Marshal John Reed. I have a warrant for the arrest of Jack Turner. Open the door, Heston, or I'll kick it down." Jack's blood ran cold. It was over. Miller had gotten to the law. He looked at Heston, ready to fight their way out. But Heston held up a hand, a strange, thoughtful look on his face. "John Reed," he mused. "They sent the bulldog." He looked at Jack. "Reed is different. He's a legend. Utterly incorruptible. He doesn't bow to political pressure." "He's here to arrest me," Jack said, his voice flat. "Yes," Heston agreed. "But maybe that's exactly what we need." Heston walked to the door and unbolted it. Standing in the doorway was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a weathered face, a thick gray mustache, and the coldest blue eyes Jack had ever seen. He was flanked by two deputies. Marshal Reed's eyes found Jack immediately. "Jack Turner," he said, his voice like gravel. "You're a hard man to find." "I haven't been hiding," Jack said, his hand still on his pistol. "Put the gun down, son," the marshal said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You're under arrest for the murder of Billy Miller." "It was self-defense," Jack stated. "That's for a judge to decide," Reed replied. He stepped into the room, his presence filling the small office. His eyes fell on the copy of the Clarion on Heston's desk. He picked it up and read the headline. He was silent for a full minute, his expression unreadable. Then he looked at Heston. "You lit quite a fire, Freddie." "Just holding a match to the truth, John," Heston said. Marshal Reed folded the newspaper and tucked it into his coat. He looked back at Jack. "You'll be transported back to Redemption Creek to stand trial." Back to Redemption Creek. It was a death sentence. Jack knew he would never make it to the courthouse. He'd have an accident on the trail. "Marshal," Heston interjected, "if you take him back there, you're delivering him to his executioners. You read the story, you know what's happening in that town." Reed's cold blue eyes didn't waver. "My job is to execute warrants, not to read newspapers. He's wanted for murder in that jurisdiction. That's where he has to go." The deputies stepped forward and took Jack's pistol. They put him in cuffs. The cold steel felt like a final defeat. As they led him out of the office and down the stairs, he felt the weight of his failure. He had the truth, he had the evidence, but it wasn't enough. The system was still going to grind him up and spit him out. He had one last desperate card to play. As they reached the street, he stopped and turned to the marshal. "Before you take me back to die," he said, his voice low and urgent, "there's a name you need to know. A name that's not in that journal." Marshal Reed paused, a flicker of interest in his eyes. "What name?" "Deputy Evan Grant, the man who was murdered," Jack said. "Before he died, he managed to send one last letter to an old friend from his Army days, a man he trusted completely. He told his friend he was onto something big and dangerous in Redemption Creek. "Get on with it, Turner," Reed said impatiently. Jack took a breath. "The friend he wrote to was you, Marshal. The letter is in the journal, addressed to you." The world seemed to stop. Marshal John Reed's face, which had been a mask of stone, suddenly changed. The icy professionalism in his eyes was replaced by a flash of raw, human emotion. He stared at Jack, his mouth slightly agape. "Evan," he whispered, the name a ghost on his lips. "You're telling me Evan Grant—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. He strode back past his deputies, up the stairs to Heston's office, and burst through the door. Jack heard him shouting, "Where is it? Where's the journal?" A moment later, Reed came back down, the small leather book in his hand. He flipped through the pages with trembling fingers until he found it. Tucked into a small pocket in the back cover was a folded sealed envelope. On it, written in familiar handwriting, were the words, "For John Reed." The marshal stood there on the sidewalk, under the gaslights of Denver, and stared at the letter from his dead friend. The warrant, the deputies, the city itself. It all seemed to fade away. The bulldog of the U.S. Marshals had just been given a bone, and it was a personal one. This was no longer just a job. This was justice. Marshal Reed didn't open the letter there on the street. He simply tucked it inside his coat, next to the newspaper. The look on his face had transformed. The cold, impartial lawman was gone. In his place was a man with a mission, and his eyes held the promise of a coming storm. He turned to his deputies. "Change of plans," he said, his voice now laced with steel. "Mr. Turner is not going back to Redemption Creek. He's coming with me. We're placing him in federal protective custody." He looked at Jack, and for the first time Jack saw not an adversary, but an ally. A very dangerous ally. "You're going to tell me everything you know, Turner. And I mean everything. We're going to tear this town apart, piece by piece, until we find every last rotten timber." The next week was a whirlwind. Jack was housed in a secure room in the federal building, where he spent hours with Marshal Reed and a team of trusted deputies, detailing everything he knew. He described the layout of his ranch, the town, the faces of Miller and his men. Reed, in turn, read his friend Evan's final letter, his face grim. The letter confirmed everything in the journal and more, detailing the gun-running plot and Evan's suspicion that it was tied to a plan for secession, a lunatic scheme by Mayor Thompson to carve out his own personal kingdom. Meanwhile, Heston's newspaper story had become a national sensation. The pressure on the territorial governor and the War Department in Washington was immense. An official investigation was launched, with Marshal Reed placed in command. "We can't just ride in with the cavalry," Reed explained to Jack one evening, poring over a map. "Thompson will have watchers on every road. The second they see a column of troops, they'll destroy the evidence and kill any witnesses left. That includes your friend Laura, if she's still in the area." Jack's heart clenched at the mention of her name. He'd been sick with worry, not knowing if she'd made it to Fort Bridger or if Miller's men had found her. "We have to go in quiet," Reed continued. "A small team. You, me, and 2 of my best men. We'll go in undercover as prospectors. We get into town, we secure the evidence and the witnesses, and then I give the signal for the cavalry, who will be waiting 20 miles out." It was a crazy plan. 4 men against a town run by killers who were expecting trouble. "They'll be looking for me," Jack said. "No," Reed said with a grim smile. "They'll be looking for Jack Turner, the rancher. They won't recognize Jack Turner, the grizzled, half-starved gold prospector." 3 days later, 4 men who looked like they'd spent months in the mountains rode a trail into the valley that held Redemption Creek. They were leading pack mules and their clothes were ragged. Jack had a thick, dirty beard and wore a floppy hat that hid most of his face. The town felt different. There was a tension in the air so thick you could taste it. Men with rifles lounged on porch fronts, and they weren't friendly-looking townsfolk. They were hard-faced guards. Miller had turned the town into a fortress. They stabled their horses and took a room at the boarding house, claiming they were there to resupply. That night, under the cover of darkness, Jack slipped out alone. He had to know if Laura was still at his ranch. He had to try. He moved through the night like a wraith, using all his fieldcraft to avoid the patrols that now roamed the outskirts of town. When he finally saw his ranch house, a dark silhouette on a low hill, his heart was pounding. There was no light in the windows. The place looked deserted. His hope sank. She was gone. Either she'd made it to Fort Bridger or the other thing. He crept up to the porch, his pistol in his hand. He tried the door. It was unlocked. That was a bad sign. He pushed it open slowly. The house was silent, musty. He stepped inside and his foot kicked something on the floor. He knelt down. It was a spent rifle cartridge. And that's when he heard the faint sound from the bedroom, a soft whimper. He moved toward the bedroom door, his heart in his throat. He pushed it open, and he saw her. Laura was huddled in the corner, clutching the Winchester rifle he had given her. She was thinner, and her eyes were wide with terror, but she was alive. "Laura," he whispered. Her head snapped up. She squinted in the dark, then her eyes widened in recognition. "Jack?" He rushed to her side. "I came back. I told you I would." "They came," she whispered, her body trembling. "A few days after you left. Miller's men. They surrounded the house. I held them off. I fired through the windows. They set fire to the barn, tried to smoke me out, but they left. I don't know why. Jack knew why. The newspaper story had broken. Miller had pulled his men back to town to consolidate his power, not wanting to be caught in the act. Suddenly, Laura's eyes looked past him, toward the open doorway. The terror returned to her face. "Jack," she breathed. "Behind you." Jack spun around, raising his pistol. Framed in the bedroom doorway stood Sheriff Miller himself, a shotgun held loosely in his hands. And behind him were 4 of his deputies, their guns all pointed directly at Jack. "Well, well, well," Miller said, a slow, evil smile spreading across his face. "Look what the cat dragged in. I knew you'd be stupid enough to come back here. You just saved me the trouble of hunting you down." He had walked right into the trap. Reed and his men were back at the boarding house, unaware. He was alone, outgunned, and his only path to escape was blocked by the man who wanted him dead more than anyone else in the world. "It's over, Turner," Miller sneered. "For both of you." The click of Miller cocking both hammers on his shotgun echoed in the silent house like a death knell. Jack stood frozen, shielding Laura with his body, his mind racing. There was no way out. 5 guns against his 1. It was suicide. "Drop the pistol, Turner," Miller commanded, the twin barrels of the shotgun looking like 2 dark tunnels to the afterlife. Nice and slow. Jack knew that the moment his gun hit the floor, they were both dead. He had to do something, anything, to change the odds. He slowly began to lower his pistol, his eyes darting around the dark room, looking for a miracle. And then he saw it, the old oil lamp on the bedside table. In one fluid motion, he didn't drop his gun. He fired it, not at Miller, but at the lamp. The room exploded in a shower of glass and burning oil. Flames erupted, catching instantly on the dry curtains and the old wooden bed frame. Thick, choking smoke filled the small space. "Fire!" one of the deputies yelled in panic. In the chaos and confusion, Jack grabbed Laura's hand. "Now!" he yelled. He shoved her toward the bedroom window. "Go! Get out!" He fired 2 more shots into the doorway to keep Miller and his men back, the muzzle flashes illuminating their shocked faces in the swirling smoke. Laura smashed the window with the butt of her rifle and scrambled out into the night. Jack was right behind her. He dove through the broken window, rolling as he hit the ground outside, shards of glass stinging his back. Gunshots erupted from the house. Bullets chewed up the dirt around them. "This way!" Jack yelled, pulling Laura toward the relative darkness of the open fields. They ran, hand in hand, fueled by pure adrenaline, the crack of rifles echoing behind them. The house was now fully engulfed in flames, a giant, roaring funeral pyre lighting up the night sky. He had sacrificed his home, everything he owned, for a few seconds of distraction. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs felt like lead. They finally collapsed in a deep ditch a mile from the house, gasping for air, watching the orange glow on the horizon. Did we lose them?" Laura panted. "For now," Jack said. But he knew Miller would be coming. He would gather every man he had and scour the countryside. "What do we do now, Jack?" she asked, her voice filled with despair. "They'll find us." Jack looked at her, at the fierce, determined set of her jaw, even in the midst of this terror. He thought of Marshal Reed waiting in town. He thought of the journal. The fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "No, they won't," he said, a new cold resolve hardening his voice. "We're not going to run anymore. We're going to finish this. Tonight." "How?" "Miller thinks we're running scared, trying to get away," Jack explained, his mind working faster than it ever had before. "He'll send his men out here to beat the bushes for us, but he'll keep a skeleton crew in town to guard his headquarters." "His headquarters?" "The saloon," Jack said. "He and the mayor run everything out of the office upstairs. The real evidence, their financial ledgers, the proof of the gun running. It's all there. That's the heart of the snake, and we're going to cut it out." They made their way back toward Redemption Creek, circling around, moving through the shadows like ghosts. The town was in an uproar. Men with torches and rifles were gathering in the main street, getting organized into search parties by a frantic Mayor Thompson. It was exactly as Jack had predicted. They slipped through the back alleys, sticking to the darkness. They reached the rear of the saloon. Jack pointed to a second-story window. That's the office. Getting up there was the problem. But then Laura pointed. A large trellis, thick with overgrown rose bushes, ran right up the back wall, almost to the window. Can you climb? Jack whispered. She just nodded, her face set. They scaled the trellis, the thorns tearing at their clothes and skin. When they reached the window, it was locked. Jack used the butt of his pistol to carefully break a single pane of glass, reached in, and unlatched it. They slid inside. The office was dark, smelling of stale whiskey and cigar smoke. They were in. They lit a small match. The office was opulent, with a huge oak desk, leather chairs, and a large imposing iron safe in the corner. It'll be in there, Jack said, his heart sinking. He'd never be able to crack a safe like that. But Laura wasn't looking at the safe. She was looking at a large portrait of Mayor Thompson on the wall. She walked over to it, a strange look on her face. She reached out and tilted the portrait to the side. Behind it was another, smaller, wall safe. This one was older, simpler. How did you know? Jack whispered, amazed. My father, she said, her voice thick with emotion. He mentioned it in his journal, a secret safe. He wrote down the combination. She recited a sequence of numbers from memory. Jack's hands trembled as he worked the dial. Left, right, left. He heard a faint click. He pulled the heavy iron door open. Inside was not one, but 3 thick ledgers, and a stack of telegraphs, and a deed. The deed to Jack's ranch, already signed over to Mayor Thompson, dated for the following week. They had found it, the mother lode, the proof of everything. And that's when they heard the footsteps on the stairs outside the office door. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. Someone was coming. They were trapped. The only way out was the way they'd come in, and there was no time. The doorknob began to turn. In that final, terrifying moment, Jack looked at Laura, holding the books that had cost her father his life. They had the truth in their hands, but it looked like they were going to die with it. The door swung open. It wasn't Sheriff Miller. It was Marshal John Reed, and behind him were his 2 deputies, shotguns leveled. Reed took in the scene. Jack and Laura, the open safe, the ledgers in her hands. A slow, grim smile touched his lips. Looks like we're a little late to the party, he said. Good work, you two. Relief, so powerful and absolute it made Jack's knees weak, washed over him. But it was short-lived. A furious shout came from the street below. They're in the saloon! They're in my office! Mayor Thompson's voice shrill with panic and rage. The game was up. The whole town now knew where they were. Time to go, Reed said, his voice all business. We've got what we came for. Now we just have to live long enough to use it. They barricaded the office door with a heavy oak desk. Gunshots erupted from the street, shattering the front windows. Glass flew everywhere. This is our Alamo, one of the deputies muttered, reloading his shotgun. Not today, Reed growled. We're not making a last stand. We're punching a hole. They had the element of surprise from above. They took positions at the shattered windows, Jack and Laura fighting right alongside the federal lawmen. They laid down a withering field of fire into the street below, driving Miller's men back for cover. Under the cover of their fire, Reed gave the signal he'd planned. He pulled a strange-looking pistol from his coat, a flare gun. He fired it out the window. A bright red flare shot up into the night sky, burning with an intense crimson light before exploding in a shower of sparks. The signal for the cavalry. Now we just have to hold them off for 20 minutes, Reed yelled over the gunfire. Those 20 minutes felt like 20 years. Miller's men, enraged and desperate, launched a full-scale assault on the saloon. Bullets tore through the thin walls. The sound was deafening. They fought back with everything they had, the small office filling with gun smoke and the smell of cordite. Just when it seemed their ammunition was running out and the sheer number of attackers was about to overwhelm them, they heard it, a new sound, faint at first, then growing louder. A bugle call, and then the thunder of 100 horses galloping hard. The cavalry had arrived. The fight turned into a rout. Caught between the lawmen in the saloon and a troop of angry soldiers, Miller's men threw down their guns and surrendered. Jack watched from the window as Sheriff Miller, seeing it was over, tried to make a run for it. He darted into a back alley, but Marshal Reed had seen him too. "He's mine," Reed said, his voice deadly quiet. He handed the ledgers to one of his deputies. "Get these to the captain." Then he went down the stairs and out into the chaos. Jack followed him. This was a reckoning he had to see. He found them in the alley behind the saloon, Miller and Reed circling each other like wolves. "It's over, Miller," Reed said. "You're done." "Not until you're dead, lawman," Miller spat and drew his pistol. But Reed was faster, much faster. 2 shots rang out, echoing between the buildings. Miller staggered back, a look of shocked disbelief on his face, before collapsing into the dirt. It was finished. The sun rose on a different Redemption Creek. Federal soldiers patrolled the streets. The mayor, the reverend, and all their henchmen were in chains. The town's long nightmare was over. In the aftermath, on the steps of the courthouse, the summer sky seemed wider and bluer than ever before. Laura stood beside Jack, not as a victim, but as a survivor, a victor. She had not only survived, but she had brought down the corrupt empire that had murdered her father. She looked at Jack, her eyes clear and full of a future he hadn't dared to imagine. "What now?" she asked. Jack looked at the smoking ruin of his ranch on the horizon, then back at her. He had lost his home, but he had found something far more valuable. He smiled, a real, genuine smile. The kind of smile a man wears when the hardest part is finally over. "We rebuild," he said. Looking back, Jack would tell you the fight wasn't just about bringing down a few bad men in a dusty, forgotten town. It was about proving that one person's voice, one person's courage, can be enough to shatter a conspiracy of silence. It was about proving that standing up, especially when the odds are stacked against you and the danger is real, can change everything. And maybe that's the real question for all of us, isn't it? When that moment comes in your life, when you see an evil standing right out in the open, will you look away or will you stand your ground? If this story meant something to you and you want to hear more tales of justice from the forgotten corners of history, then do me a favor. Hit that like button and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next ride. Because out here, there's always another trail, another story, and another chance to do what's right.